time. So, please, stage is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, first let me thank you for setting up this wonderful conference. I've already benefited greatly from the talks that have been given. Now let's talk about God. I want to discuss how to best construe an argument for the existence of God from a divine intervention, and in particular from a divine intervention for the purpose of bringing about life. So an argument from the origin of life for the existence of God. I want to investigate how to construe that best. I will first present some presuppositions and address some preliminaries without defending the various details. We can do that in the discussion. And then I will defend in some more depth the crucial premise. So, preliminaries about the epistemology. I add this because there is an old style epistemology, I call it old, and it's sort of out of fashion, which is prevalent or was prevalent in particular in Germany. I think, and that's why I address a few issues, and it's important in order to evaluate this kind of argument and in order to evaluate what I'm trying to do. So the old style binary epistemology focused very much on the concept of knowledge. So books on epistemology, introductions on epistemology, started with long discussions about what knowledge is. And the assumption was that knowledge is the central notion of epistemology, and we need to understand what knowledge is. And the assumption was also that knowledge is a particularly valuable epistemological state. So it's particular certainty, and that's what we need to get at. And if we can have knowledge, that's sort of the very optimistic view, and many then defended we can't have knowledge. That was the old view. In connection to this, there was generally taken to be an opposition between knowledge and belief, and if it's just belief, then it's much less certain and much less valuable epistemically than if it's knowledge. So again, this Platonic notion of knowledge as something which can hardly be achieved, and if it's achieved, it's the greatest thing in epistemology. In the consequence of this, often in philosophy, and that's still sometimes happening today in German-speaking philosophy, an argument is conceived to be a deductive argument. That's taken to be what a real argument should be like. That's not what they do in everyday life, but when they come to philosophy classes and to logic classes, they say, what's an argument? And they tell the students that it's a deductive set of propositions. Then, when an argument is presented for a real conclusion, for a real claim, for example, the existence of God, some philosophers would look at the premises and would say that argument isn't valid because you can't deduce deductively the one premise from the other, therefore the argument is no good. Also another response to arguments in this mindset, also often found in response to theistic arguments, is that you look at one premise and you say, well, that premise can be rejected, and therefore that argument is not good, meaning that the argument doesn't compel anyone. So the idea was that in epistemology, and with an argument, if it's really an argument, you need to compel somebody to accept the conclusion and to accept the premises too. So there was a strong emphasis on certainty, and everything that was below that is easily dismissed. And that epistemology, I think, was no good. It was very misleading, and in general in philosophy, we are moving away from that kind of epistemology. So we don't take the concept of knowledge to be fundamental anymore, but rather the concept of belief as fundamental, where the concept of belief is so broad that it includes beliefs of all strength and of all justifications. So a belief can be very well justified, so there is no opposition between knowledge and truth anymore, because knowledge is also a belief. Every state of knowledge is also a state of a belief. That's trivial nowadays to philosophers, but I thought I'd better mention it in order to see where we are coming from and how we do epistemology today, or how I think we should be doing it. And knowledge, nowadays we see much more relaxed. First, we generally, given the huge amount of paper and finished woods cut down for the purpose of discussing what the concept of knowledge is, we generally recognize today that there is no one definition of it. It's sort of used in one situation differently from another situation. And secondly, we've come to see that knowledge really isn't this one greatest thing in epistemology, but really knowledge is something very ordinary. We know lots of things. I know that the sun is shining outside. I know that there are very competent people in this room. I know that I have 3 children, and I know many things. And I don't have great certainty about it, but it's perfect knowledge. So that means that first, knowledge is ubiquitous, and secondly, that isn't such a great thing, and it's not very hard to have. So we move away from this Platonic notion of knowledge and just look at belief, and then we look at truth, we ask for truth, and then we look at justification. And with these elements, I think we are much more, if we look at this and try to improve our situation with respect to these, in particular with respect to justification, and if we try to gain truth, and if we try to do what raises our chances of having true beliefs, then we are on a much better path in epistemology and in philosophy. And then, of course, we now are looking for arguments that are inductive, that is, we use as a model of what an argument is and should be, not something that logic professors present as an argument, but we more look at what an argument in ordinary life is and in scientific discourse is, or philosophical discourse is. And we see it's not deductive, because if you have a deductive argument, you only get what you put into the premises. Deductive arguments in most philosophical questions don't help you very much, because the premises are rather simple and you can see quite clearly what's in them. It's not like in mathematics where you have a formula and can spell out something very deeply hidden. In ordinary philosophical discussions, we have premises that are much more simple, so deductive arguments don't get us very far. We use, in philosophy and in many other situations in ordinary life, we use inductive arguments. We use premises which are relatively uncontroversial, or where we have some chance that our opponent will share them, and then we try to spell out that somehow supports my view to some extent. So we need premises that are shared by the opponent, and then we need bridge principles, epistemological principles, probability principles, which are about which proposition supports which proposition to which degree, and we require these. They might be shared by the opponent. If not, we also need to discuss these, but the general form of the argument is rather that we look for a premise that the other person shares, and don't just look for what can be deduced deductively from this, but use more a detective method, like when we use it when we look for the murderer and we look at the dagger and we find a fingerprint of Smith on it, and we say that's evidence for Smith being the murderer, though we take into account that Smith might have used that dagger for another purpose. So then the evidence isn't that strong. So that kind of reasoning is what we need. So arguments and certainty and justification are gradual, rather than either it's valid or it's not valid. They can support some item of evidence can support a hypothesis just for a very small degree and still be valuable, and it doesn't need to yield certainty. So you can have lots of evidence, and each of that is rather weak, but cumulatively it may be very strong. We apply, and gradual, I think, can be linked also to the concept of probability. We've mentioned that in the discussion before. So generally it's today assumed that the probability calculus can be used also to model or describe epistemic probability, though no specific numbers can be ascribed. That can be debated, but that's generally assumed today, following Keynes, I think, that the probabilistic mathematical calculus of probability can be used even though no particular numbers can be attributed. And the issue was raised before. This is probability that's not at all limited to statistics. Statistical probability is just one very specific case of probability, or even an entirely different kind of probability, depending how you apply it. We need probability as we have it, for example, in the detective case, where we find some fingerprint, for example, and then ask, well, just how much does it support that hypothesis that Smith was the murderer? And then there are no numbers, but we do have some handle on that being strong evidence or not so strong evidence. We see what factors make it strong or would weaken it. So we are reasoning probabilistically in this sense, though I add this kind of probability that's required here, maybe just the ordinary concept of probability and not the mathematical one. But generally it's assumed that the mathematical calculus also models this one. So we are using cumulative evidence with this probabilistic mindset and approach. We gather evidence and then add it together. And I should also emphasize again that this formulating problems in terms of what's the hypothesis and what's the evidence does change questions and arguments sometimes quite a bit. Because you then need to formulate something as evidence which is relatively uncontroversial. And as an hypothesis, there you put everything in the hypothesis, what is controversial, and then make the two into a relationship. And you need to spell out exactly what your hypothesis is. When you discuss, for example, evidence for the existence of God, you first need to say what kind of God you're talking about, and not discuss the existence of God, and then in the end it turns out that the one person means a creator God and the other person means energy. So that's just a rather simple point, but I wanted to mention that in the beginning. Now let's turn to the issue, and as I just said, we need the hypothesis first. So while many of the preceding talks just said let's look for the design and leave it more or less open, design implies a kind of an agent, but even that you didn't spell out, and now I as a philosopher say, let's do it differently, let's put the hypothesis on the table, and the hypothesis is that there is a God. And then I need to give a definition. I use a standard definition that's used in philosophy and in Christianity. So God is a bodiless person, good, omnipotent, and omniscient. I just mentioned that. I don't spell it out here. Person means that he can act, and it means that he can act for reasons. So whereas apes probably can act only on inclinations, bodiless person in this sense here can act on reasons, and that's the reason why that person has an explanatory power for the evidence I will consider. It is important here that God is good. One might think that one has a safer case, a stronger argument, if one uses as a hypothesis just some person brought it about. Now that could be, and one might be inclined to think, well, you have less attributes there, therefore it's a more general premise, therefore it's more probable. But besides considerations of simplicity, if you don't say what kind of person you're talking about, you have no clue about the motives that person would have, and you have no clue about what kind of thing that person would bring about. And if you have a person and you only know it's omnipotent but have no clue what it could bring about, then it's not going to be supported by evidence very much, though I would admit that it can be supported to some degree. But I think this hypothesis, there will be much more evidence for this hypothesis than for the more general hypothesis that there is some bodiless, powerful person. Because if God is good and even perfectly good, we have quite a handle on the motives that he has, namely, if we discover that something is good and valuable, we know that that's the sort of thing he would bring about. So that's the reason why we use the full theistic hypothesis here with God being good. We use here, or we argue here for the main hypothesis by using a sub-hypothesis that God brought about life by intervention. And I need to say what a divine intervention is. I'll summarize that, and you can discuss it afterwards. A divine intervention is an event that was brought about by God directly, and that was incompatible with an event towards which a causal process was heading. For this, you need the notion of a causal process. That's a process that's heading in a certain direction and is usually governed by laws of nature, or always governed by laws of nature. And you need this heading in a direction in order to then be able to say that an agent can bring about an event that's stopping that process. So it's like a cat jumping on a table, or me holding the billiard ball rolling. I put there an event that's incompatible with an event towards which the process was heading, so the ball has to stop, although otherwise, had I not put my hand here, it would have carried on. So that's an intervention. It's that by direct action means that God brings about the event directly so that the event has no preceding cause. The event is brought about by the agent, by God in this case, and has no preceding cause, but the only cause is the person, the action of the person, but not in a preceding sense, but the event is the action of a person. That's what agents can do, according to the hypothesis. I exclude any bias against divine interventions. I think that all bias, probability attributions, probability attributions, all bias against divine intervention, against interventions is in unjustified. Methodological naturalism is an irrational principle. It just rules out some hypothesis that's not rational and that's not science. I can justify that more, but I'm saying that cannot be done. The only thing that you can do is that if you, for example, consider God, you can say, well, he doesn't intervene very often. I don't see my people rising from the dead very often, so God apparently doesn't do that very often. Therefore, that lowers the prior probability of a resurrection to some degree. But other than that, this correction or this presumption that's based on experience, there shouldn't be any bias against interventions. You just have various hypotheses, and the one is a intervention hypothesis, and the other hypothesis is a naturalist hypothesis, and you just need to gather the evidence, and you mustn't rule out one from the beginning. Now, the evidence is life originated in the universe, and that's supposed to be uncontroversial, so I assume that life hasn't been going on for eternity. I'm using that as evidence. An argument from E to H, and to an explanation of the origin of life in terms of a divine intervention. That's what I'm looking for. I'm using then in this probability and explanation, I'm combining the two in the philosophy of science. Sometimes people use this exclusively, but I think we need and can use both together. So the key question is, of course, whether the probability of the evidence, given that there is no God, is very low. The probability of, given that there is a God, the probability that life will originate is not too low. It's not that God has to do that, but it's the sort of thing God might well do if we consider life to be a good thing, and we could spell that out in more detail. What's mainly controversial here is the probability of the origin of life, given that there is no God. So in order to, my argument here is only strong if that probability is very low. So how probable is it that life would arise in the universe without a divine intervention? In order to answer that question, we need knowledge of the type. Things of type X cause things of type Y. We need an idea of what causes what, of what can happen in what kind of scenario. We need a sense of the word cause here that's wider than the ordinary usage. We need to include carrying on here too. We need to ask what can happen in what kind of scenario, and what do we know about it through our experience of the causal processes. Some take a skeptical view here. Alvin Plantinga, here at the last point, I don't dare to touch this button. Alvin Plantinga, for example, writes, "It is hard in excelsis to say how low the probability of the unguided evolution of, for example, a protein machine is." To this I object that we know quite much about what causes what, and that kind of stance is incompatible with what we actually do know and assume to know. We know that a stone of granite carries on to exist largely unchanged for years or centuries, and does not turn into a lump of gold or into a frog. So when we find a lump of gold, we know that it did not develop out of a stone of granite. Man's ordinary experience does not exclude that some matter turns into gold through some procedure, while some advanced knowledge of chemistry shows that this is possible but requires levels of energy that do not occur naturally on Earth today. Objecting to Christianity, it was often claimed that the resurrection of a human corpse is impossible. While that is not true, it is true that a corpse will never come to life on its own without a divine intervention. Therefore, if we see a resurrection, then we know that God intervened. All average human beings know that. This knowledge does not require any knowledge of medicine. One might be able to deepen it, but that's not required, and it's the assumption that that cannot happen is justified without medical knowledge. Similarly, we know that no physical influence will bring the fish in a tin to life again, even though the proteins and most of the other stuff is already there. You should think that might be easy, but we know quite certain that that's not going to happen, whatever physical influence you apply to that tin. These examples of causal knowledge are clear cases of justified beliefs. They are among our solidly justified beliefs. If some philosophical theory says that these beliefs are not justified, we should reject that theory rather than these causal beliefs. Let us investigate such causal knowledge more closely. Causal knowledge comes in various degrees of precision. At the precise end, there is causal knowledge that includes knowledge of mathematically formulated laws of nature. Examples of less precise causal knowledge are beliefs like corpses do not come to life without a divine intervention, and stones of granite do not turn into lumps of gold. That they are less precise does not mean that they are less true. It only means that they contain less precise descriptions of the states of affairs involved. Corpses do not come to life without a divine intervention does not entail a description of what is in corpses, but it's still entirely true. Now we need to consider what laws of nature are. The common philosophical assumption is that laws of nature entail regularities of the form all events of type X are followed by events of type Y. These are regularities of succession, and it's generally assumed that laws entail these regularities. I'm presupposing here that this view is false, because in fact all causes can be counteracted, not only by God or animals, but also by non-living things. This is obvious if we consider an example, a real law like the law of gravitation. It does not say that any two bodies accelerate to a certain degree, because that would not be true. There may be other things in addition that affect their acceleration. What the law of gravitation says instead is that in situations of a certain type, there is a force of a certain type acting on the bodies towards each other. David Hume's approach to knowledge about laws, therefore, is also wrong. We don't know laws of nature by observing that the sun rises one morning, that it rises the next morning, and then at some stage concluding that the sun rises every morning. It is not a law of nature that the sun rises every morning. In order to know a real law of nature, such as the law of gravitation, observing a force in one instance of a specific situation is enough if we are justified in assuming that no other things than those that we are taking into account are acting in this situation. That's why we try to isolate our experiments or your experiments in the labs from interferences of the relevant kinds. You need to make observations for various masses and distances, but for two particular bodies and a particular distance, you do not need to repeat the very same experiment 100 times in order to confirm the law. A law of nature says roughly that there are forces of a certain kind in situations of a certain kind. This is so, in my view, without any exception and necessarily. Even God cannot change the laws, though he could create different matter with different laws. But as I said, laws entail no regularities of the form events of type X are followed by events of type Y. But they do say something important about causation, and perdurance. They entail claims of the form: events of type X are followed by and cause events of type Y if nothing counteracts and prevents Y. So it's a conditional generalizability. This should be very obvious, I think, but I'm pretty much lonely in defending that. Therefore, if you observe that in one case, an event, this is the last point of the slide, it's an important point, therefore I give it here. If you observe that in one case, an event of type X caused an event of type Y, and then you observe that in another case, an event of type X does not cause an event of type Y, then you know that in the second case, something counteracted. This can be anything. It can be a material thing, an animal, a man, a ghost, or God. That is how we detect interventions. We can find out which thing in particular counteracted if we have more information about which things there are, which they were, where they were at the time, and what their powers and motives are. So we have further means of finding out which thing intervenes, but we can figure out in the way indicated first that something intervenes. Sometimes through detecting an intervention, we can conclude that a certain thing exists. For example, if we know that Jesus rose from the dead, then we can conclude that God exists, because nobody else could have done that. I repeat, laws of nature entail claims of the form: events of type X are followed by and cause events of type Y if nothing counteracts and prevents Y. That is applicable also to cases where we have no knowledge of a mathematically formulated law. Whenever we observe a case of causation and know that an event of type X caused an event of type Y, we know that X events always cause Y events if nothing counteracts. That is how we acquire causal knowledge. We observe that a stone of granite carries on without changing much in its observable properties. Only after a long time, some of these properties change. Even an observation that does not involve a chemical analysis of the use or the use of instruments of physical measurement yields causal knowledge. We have causal knowledge through our ordinary experience. We have some description of the cause and of the effect and know that conditional generalizability is true for this. This principle does a lot of work in our acquisition of causal knowledge. Obtaining causal knowledge and knowledge of laws does not involve human induction, but it involves observing several cases, plays a role in the justification of the assumption that nothing else is acting in the situation. And that's also the reason why you do experiments, in order to isolate certain processes. We obtain causal knowledge from our experience in an automatic way. Usually we do not think much about general conditional causal statements, but we are increasing in causal knowledge as we observe and interact with things attentively. Much causal knowledge is acquired during childhood, but it's not acquired if the children play only with electronic games instead of playing with sticks and mud. So scientific investigation can increase causal knowledge, but we acquire it also in the ordinary way. How then do we know whether some material object may bring about living organisms? We often observe that animals die and that they never come to life again. We never observe that non-living matter causes living organisms. We believe that we know that animals and humans do not come to life again. If we see a corpse come to life again, we know that God intervened. We have a certain understanding of what kinds of thing material states of affairs can cause. Non-living material states of affairs cause non-living material states of affairs. The matter of which our universe consists of a limited set of kinds of things and kinds of properties. Non-living material things can change the combination of these properties, but never come to life. In some situations, stars can come into existence. These develop in a certain way until they dissolve or explode. The non-living material universe, if God does not intervene, just shuffles around the various kinds of material things and of material properties. A combination of non-living material things and properties always carries on as a further combination of non-living material things and properties. It never brings about living organisms. That is what we are justified to believe, even just through our ordinary experience without hearing such enlightening talks as the two this morning. Therefore, we know that if living... we can leave that actually, that's fine. And therefore, we know that if living organisms come into existence, God intervened and brought them about. There you go. That is similar to our knowledge that if a man rises from the dead, God intervened and raised him. The reason for that may be that living organisms have souls, and that matter does not cause souls. But even if living organisms don't have souls, it can still be true that non-living matter cannot bring about living organisms. There may be some other property which is essential to life and which matter cannot cause. Or the reason why non-living matter cannot bring about living organisms may just be that in a living organism, too many things and properties have to be in the right place and tuned, as we heard in this talk about circularity this morning. Here, the popular illustration of a monkey with a typewriter producing an English poem have a point. For all we know, non-living matter just does not have that power to bring about life. However, if living organisms have no soul, perhaps there is a possibility how non-living matter could produce living organisms. There could be very special things which produce living organisms. They would be something like seeds or eggs. Of course, their existence would be evidence that God had created them, but in theory, God could have done that already when he brought about the universe into being. Perhaps God could have programmed some matter so that it produces living organisms. It is an empirical question whether there is some support for this speculation. However, already at first sight, the question arises where these seeds were before the planet Earth came into existence and how they then came to the Earth. I don't think that this is plausible, but we need to consider the possibility. I conclude that the belief that non-living matter, except when it contains something like eggs, cannot bring about living organisms, and that belief is strongly justified. Therefore, we have good reason to believe that life came into being through God's intervention. This raises the important research question exactly which living things God brought about directly. I would like to know that, but that hasn't been my question. Thank you.